Amazing panel. Colorado Opioid Synergy Larimer and Weld. Yes, this is the famous CO-SLAW I'm always talking about. They're going to talk to you a little bit about how they did what they did. Hub and spoke models kind of started in Vermont, if I'm not mistaken, and CO-SLAW just took this and ran with it. This model, exactly the way they've done it in their counties, might not necessarily work for you in your region, but I do think there are ways to improve our continuum of care and helping with people, whether they're coming out of treatment, incarceration, et cetera. So these speakers are going to give you a great idea of how to do that. So we have Queen here. You just raise your hand, Miss Queen. Princess Wave. Jenny Wallace. We have MJ Jorgensen. Heather Ihrig. Heather, did I say your last name right? Like, I've known you forever. How do you say it? Ihrig. Okay, I won't say that wrong again. She's on our council. You think I would know. Meredith Silverstein, or Silverstein. See, I'm about in 1,000 here. And Cyndi Dodds. I got that one right. All right, I will let you take it away. Who's going first? All right, MJ, you're all set. Thank you.
Also down at the end, we have Dr. Lesley Brooks.
Oh, my goodness. The famous.
The famous. The one and only. All right, so as Heidi introduced, we are going to talk about the famous CO-SLAW today, not the barbecue side, but we are actually going to also talk about the broader umbrella of work that this group has put together for the Northern Colorado region. And so we'll talk about CO-SLAW, but not just CO-SLAW. Panel presenters, yeah. So NOCO Cares is the Northern Colorado Collaborative for Addiction and Recovery Support, and that is the overarching regional network of folks in Northern Colorado, as the name would suggest, that came together and said, you know, we can do things differently around substance use. We don't have to keep doing things the same way time and time and time again. And really to do that, we identified 4 strategic areas to move in. Prevent the misuse and optimize use of opioids. Identify misuse of opioids and provide early intervention. Improve, so we're improving treatment and enabling recovery for people with opioid use disorders. We've expanded to addiction as a whole. And reduce, so reducing harm caused by opioid use and misuse. Now this group said, we're not just going to look at this from an individual measure, but we're going to look at our system as a whole, knowing that our systems historically haven't always done this well. They haven't always approached this from a people-centered way. And so the work that comes out of this group looks at how do we engage our system differently, how do we engage our institutions differently, our interpersonal interactions, and also our personal interactions when it comes to the work. Also, there's a little bit of a buzzing, a high-pitched buzzing. Anyone? Thank you. Love it. It's not just me. I love that for me. It's always reassuring. Right? We got to check in every once in a while there. So this work is really, it's brought together by a network of folks. These are the folks that sit on our steering committee, SummitStone Health Partners, North Colorado Health Alliance, and North Range Behavioral Health bring in some fiscal support for this work. Additionally, University of Denver, Queens Legacy Foundation, and the Health District come in on the steering committee and provide less of that fiscal support, but still provide that guidance to the work going forward. So before we move into this, part of the work that we do is education around addiction, substance use, making sure that, again, that is really centering the person in this work. So this is about the brain science of addiction, making sure we're centering folks in that modality, but also harm reduction and finding the blend of those two things. And so I am going to have you cue up the video for me.
Addiction is a disease that changes the brain. Here's how. Our brain releases dopamine to reward us when we do what we need to survive, like eat, drink, and seek shelter, and when we make connections with friends and family. It feels really good, so our brain tells us to keep doing it again and again. Our brain dopamine level is around 50 on an average day. On our best day ever, like winning a beach vacation or getting that big promotion, our dopamine level soars to around 100. On our worst day, like getting fired or losing a loved one, our dopamine level only reaches about 40. Most of us live somewhere in that 40 to 100 range on a daily basis. Using alcohol or drugs can crank the brain's dopamine up to as much as 1100, 10 times more than the brain can handle. That's a reward so big it can physically start to rewire the brain, especially if we use substances regularly or are predisposed to addiction. The brain can then start to prioritize that drug over everything else in our lives. It gets worse. Once the brain is rewired, no matter how much of the drug we use, our brain will never reach that 1100 again and will start to decrease our natural dopamine production over time until we find ourselves needing the drug just to get up to 30, worse than our worst day ever, and leaving us with barely enough dopamine to get out of bed. At this point, we aren't using the drug to get high, we're using just to feel normal and be able to function. Everyone's brain chemistry and risk factors are different, but once addicted to a substance, our brain can crave it so intensely that it consumes our life. We can start making decisions we never would have made before. An addicted brain experiences intense, off-the-charts cravings. Through research using fMRI scans to look at craving activity in the brain, we now understand just how intense cravings for drugs and alcohol can be, even more powerful than our cravings for things we need to survive, like food and water. When craving activity was measured in individuals who were severely dehydrated, their desire for water was overpowering. Visualize the size of that craving as a baseball. Subjects who went without food for several days displayed basketball-sized cravings. The cravings for drugs and alcohol in the brains of people suffering from addiction measured up to the relative size of a baseball field. And for some, the intensity of those cravings didn't lessen until after 2 years of not using. So imagine you're in recovery. Your brain is screaming 24/7 for a substance you're trying to avoid for up to 2 years. This while your dopamine level is lower than most people's worst day ever. That's the science behind why recovery can be an ongoing, difficult process. But there is hope. The brain can heal. There are more than 23 million people living in recovery in the United States today. Each is traveling a personalized path of recovery through one or combination of approaches: medications to help stabilize dopamine levels and reduce cravings, treatment programs, professional therapy, support groups, and self-directed change. Treatment works, giving patients the care, tools, hope, and support needed to recover from addiction and reclaim their lives. 1 in 10 of our neighbors lives with addiction. The disease doesn't discriminate. It affects soccer moms, lawyers, teenagers, first responders, retirees, our whole community. We all know someone who's been impacted by addiction. One of the best things we can do to help as a community is talk about it. Share our experiences, work together to halt stigma and break down barriers to care. Change our minds about what addiction really is: a chronic disease that requires treatment and ongoing support, just like any other disease. So let's start talking. Start a conversation. Save a life. ChangingMindsLarimer.org.
Okay, so that's the Changing Minds campaign, and these resources are free and available, and you should use them. That said, I do want to just acknowledge that addiction itself does not discriminate, but the way in which people receive services does. Not everyone has the same ability to access care as the next person sitting next to them. So we see these data, 1 in 10 of our neighbors experience addiction, and within that 1 in 10, we know there's an overwhelming prevalence of folks who occupy subordinate identities or identities not held as the norm in society. with less access to care, less access to treatment, peer support, all of those things. And so, yes, we have a problem as a community as a whole, and within our community there are folks who need us to reach differently than we have historically. So we know about addiction, but what do we know about opioids? I think a lot of us in this room have some knowledge here and there, but opioids are ultimately a class of drugs. That includes our prescriptions, that includes our heroin and fentanyl and all of these words we hear in the news. But they're all chemically related, and they interact with the opioid receptors on our brain. So these are generally safe if they're taken for a short time, which is not the story we hear on the news, and we don't want to alienate folks who are safely taking opioids every day in these conversations. But over time, we know that since they produce euphoria and they provide pain relief, it's possible that these can be misused by folks. So we can hold both things, right? So ultimately, opioids play on our limbic system, the brain stem, and our spinal cord. The limbic system controls our emotional center. Our brain stem does all those automatic things, so we're breathing, our body temp, those things we don't think about, and when we do think about it, it makes us not work right? Think about breathing for just a second. You're going to be like, right? Okay. The spinal cord, this is what receives all of our sensations. So like when I walk through this door and I stub my toe inevitably later, that pain signal goes to my spinal cord and then to my brain telling me like, don't hit your toe on that again, you silly. Ultimately, it's helpful to provide a visual though. You'll see there's a cute little golf ball and golf tee up there. That's what I want you to imagine when you're thinking about opioids. So in our brains and bodies, we have opioid receptors. Ironically, they look like a golf tee. So this is something tangible for you. That said, when opioids enter our body, they sit on the golf tee. And then they start to dampen all of those signals that we're receiving to our limbic system, our brain stem, and our spinal cord. So think about golfing when you are working on this opioid stuff together. So some examples of opioids. I won't go into these in depth, but ultimately we can categorize them as prescription pain relievers, illicit opioids, and medications used for opioid use disorder. You'll notice that fentanyl actually has two different colored bands on it. That is because that is both a prescription and an illicit synthetic. And so when we hear fentanyl, it's not necessarily one umbrella term. We're talking about prescriptions and also illicit substances, okay? And they often get conflated. So what is MAT? We've heard a lot about MAT or MOUD, that's medication-assisted treatment, medication for addiction therapy, medication for opioid use disorder. It goes on and on. Ultimately, it is medication that supports us when we're going through all of those withdrawal symptoms we saw in the video. It helps us restabilize our brain chemistry. There are three different kinds that you'll hear a lot about. So we have methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone. So when you're thinking about your golf ball, here we go again, think about full, partial, and none. All right, so our methadone is our full agonist, meaning it's going to sit on the receptor very similar to an opioid, right? Because it is an opioid, just open, and it's a treatment modality. The partial antagonist is going to be like half a golf ball, right? Won't work very well for golf, but it will for treatment. Now, this is where my metaphor goes downhill, so I need you to be prepared. And so then naltrexone is like not allowing any interface with that receptor, okay? So I'll give you another metaphor that Dr. Brooks uses, and that is in comparison to cars. So methadone is like your race car, your speed sports vehicle. Buprenorphine is your friendly family vehicle. Has a very good gas mileage in this economy, very important. And then naltrexone is like our boot on the tire. And that is giving you an indication of how much opioid is hitting that receptor. So are we taking methadone daily at our opioid treatment provider? That's our speed racer, right? Are we taking buprenorphine strips or films? That's our family vehicle, right? Those are overwhelmingly more accessible for folks because you can get those from your primary care provider in addition to addiction treatment centers. And then naltrexone is going to be the one that doesn't have any opioid receptor activity. It's just blocking it. And so that is our family car boot, so to speak. But that does require 7 days worth of detox, and that can be really hard for folks when we think about what withdrawal feels like and those cravings being the size of a baseball field. So there's a lot of content on these slides. We have a short amount of time, so I'm going to keep running, but we'll be here for questions. So a couple of frequently asked questions. How long does someone take MAT? For as long as it takes. That's how long, okay? This will be different for every patient. That is a discussion between their provider, making sure that their treatment outcomes are in alignment with their goals, okay? We don't do this for any other type of chronic illness. We don't do this for diabetes. We don't start someone on a medication and then immediately figure out when we're gonna take them off it. So since we know addiction is a chronic illness and a chronic disease, we need to start changing the way in which we operate with it. And some people will take this for the rest of their lives. That's not uncommon. It's also not something we need to be overly concerned about if it's not our patient and provider relationship. Yeah, you're up. I went as fast as I could.
That was impressive how fast you went through that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what NOCO Cares is. Like MJ said, we seek to do 4 things. We want to reduce harm. We want to prevent misuse. We want to identify opportunities for early intervention, and we want to improve treatment. With that, each of these 4 boxes represents groups of very, very passionate people who are working hard together across Weld and Larimer County in order to make change. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about the specific things we're doing to create measurable change. But first, I wanna talk a little bit about the thread that binds all of these things together, our relationships. So if you look at this, this is all the groups that come together to form NOCO Cares. And when I look at this, I'm always astounded by how many come together. The other really cool thing about this is probably not even up to date because new people are constantly coming, new organizations are constantly coming to the table. If you were to come to one of our 7 a.m. quarterly meetings on a Friday morning at Embassy Suites, and let me repeat that, 7 a.m. Friday, you would find standing room only. You should come early, okay? That doesn't happen very often. But with this, everybody wants to come together. Everyone enjoys these meetings. If you were to come to one of our meetings, you might find yourself talking to a peer that's in recovery or a CEO or medical director of an agency. You might find yourself talking to one of our care coordinators who connect people with services or service providers that they're connecting them to. You might talk to a city council member or a person from the health department or even a police officer or two. It really is a come one, come all group that comes together. When you look at these, we provide very similar services sometimes, and although everyone on here provides amazing services, sometimes we find ourselves in competition. We compete for resources, we compete for staff, we compete for clients. The coolest thing to me about NOCO Cares is that we put all that aside. It's not about competing. It's about coming together to solve problems that need to be solved. We find ourselves, we learn together, we laugh together, we check in on each other and how we're doing, we work on projects together. Those are the things that have brought this community together in order to make change. With that, we find ourselves, like the secret sauce of NOCO Cares is that relationship foundation that we've built. And people in recovery from addictions deserve that. They deserve us coming together and putting all the other stuff aside. One of the agencies within this group that has done amazing things for people and has been able to reach a marginalized community is Queen's Legacy Foundation. Queen?
Thank you, sis. Thank you, Jennifer. Hi. So I'm gonna have to agree with Jennifer 110%. When I think about the families that we serve at Queen's Legacy Foundation and at New Eyes Village Church, these families are mostly Black, and their stories are the same as other races. For the few Black folks that we serve that are dealing with substance addiction, it's very easy for me to reach out for resources and provide almost immediate service from my colleagues. Some folks aren't always comfortable going into systemic settings that are white culture, that bring on more trauma and triggers, that causes folks in the Black community to isolate and not look for support because they're already dealing with racism and other systemic oppressions. These are just a couple of the root causes that ties the Black community to the opioid addiction and sometimes overdose. Our care coordinator looks like the people that we serve, and they are able to relate to most of their stories. This is a team that sought out our nonprofit organization so that these services are diverse, equitable, and inclusive, as they should be in Larimer and in Weld counties. My hope is eventually we'll have our own space where our services are more culturally attuned to our unique concerns. But until then, we at Queen's Legacy Foundation will continue to facilitate our services and information for our community through the No Code Cares network. Having a grassroots local nonprofit that knows its community just reinforces the promise of a successful journey for Larimer and Weld Counties Black community members to take together in harm reduction services with organizations that journey with its members 100%, because representation matters. Thanks.
So going back to these 4 foundations of work, one of the areas we worked in is the NOCO Harm Reduction Alliance, really working within our communities to deliver services. It had previously been known as the Colorado Opioid Prevention, just kidding, the naloxone champions. Way too many groups in my head with too many acronyms. But yes, for focusing on these same areas of work. Again, we like to meet early in the mornings, but we just recently met coming back together after COVID and re-examining where we stood as a group and the 4 areas we wanted to continue our focus in. These are the 4 that stood out to us and might be similar in your communities. We host an annual conference, so we have provider education going on. This happens to be coming up next Monday. A few tickets are available if you happen to be interested. I will send that link out as well. But bringing a very, very widely diverse group of speakers together in person. I think we probably have 24 in total. I might be exaggerating a little, but bringing folks together to re-engage in this conversation. And then another area, identifying misuse. This is where I really come in. So 3.5 years ago, I started as the project director of Colorado Opioid Synergy for Larimer and Weld Counties, CO-SLAW for short. When I started, I would come in with a similar prop here that MJ uses. It was a like container of CO-SLAW, right? Just to get this physical idea. I heard all the jokes. They're like, CO-SLAW, where did this come from? But really to ignite a conversation. We began as a three-phased approach. We initially wanted to bring together partners in our community. We wanted to focus on two main areas where we knew folks were at extreme risk for overdose. And then we decided to create this hub and spoke operations. We thought we'd string this out. It'd be year 1, well, year 2, year 3. Nah. We jumped in all at once and decided to tackle these all together. This is the team of partners we brought together. Heidi mentioned this may or may not work for your communities, but this really is the kind of recipe or playbook that I consider would be successful in any of your areas and what you should potentially consider adopting as part of what you're looking at. The key is identifying partners that currently exist. We had amazing work going on, but it was somewhat siloed work. It was OTP clinics, as you've heard mentioned. It was federally qualified health centers, throwing in another acronym. It was primary care providers. It was residency programs. It was our OTP clinic, or our residency programs and addiction treatment providers. Okay. So this is kind of the hub and spoke that was developed. This wheel of organizations that work together, agnostic of provider and agnostic of payer source, to provide the right individualized approach for individuals. So figure out who those key stakeholders are in your community. And then grounding that within an organization, a central hub of peers and care coordinators that are resident experts of all the above. Coming together as well to develop what our mission and vision is. That's another important step. And then getting all 8 of these to sign off to agree to the same thing, that we agree to relapse as part of recovery. We agree to medication-assisted treatment with or without counseling services. These are our key components and what has worked. And then really, like I mentioned, targeting these 2 areas, the jail programs, which a fantastic presentation coming up for that, and our emergency departments. Building in inductions and continuations of all 3 forms of FDA-approved medications for inmates while they're incarcerated in Larimer County Jail, and providing care coordination and counseling services, and then focusing on transitions. And then working with our ED departments. Banner Health and UC Health have been fantastic. Folks come in withdrawal, folks come in who have overdosed, they will reverse, stabilize, and then connect to me. I carry this 1-800 number for access. I get calls 24/7 on folks wanting treatment services. Calls from Manhattan, calls from a family, a care member, anyone who is just really wanting to connect and has heard about CO-SLAW and the services that we provide.
Hi. I'm with the Butler Institute for Families at the University of Denver, and we are very proud to be the partners with CO-SLAW as the program evaluators. And so what I'm going to share with you quickly are some outcome data that that represents the first 3 years of CO-SLAW. Just briefly, these are the numbers. We've had 351 folks enrolled. And if we look at that nationally, this is a SAMHSA-funded project. So nationally, we are well above what the national enrollment rates and follow-up rates are. But here's kind of the heart of the matter. What we've seen repeatedly throughout our 3 and going into our 4 years working on this project is decreases in pretty much all the key indicators for members who are enrolled. Excuse me, that includes serious anxiety or tension, trouble understanding, concentrating or remembering, which is actually a variable that pops up frequently for us as something that as a dependent variable. And then we have prescriptions for psychological problems have increased, so we know folks are getting the prescriptions that they need. Again, on key indicators, key psychosocial indicators, living situations, how people feel about their overall health, their ability to perform daily activities, how they feel about themselves in general, so measures of self-esteem, and how they feel about their personal relationships. When we measure these at program intake to 6-month follow-up, we see consistent improvement. and same with being housed, and same with employment. So consistent positive outcomes. What we've also seen here is decrease in this chart. Hopefully you can see for most substances there's a decrease for alcohol when we combine alcohol and illegal drugs, heroin, all statistically significant decreases. And then I think this is like an artifact of some data collection or something. What's going on here with a slight increase in marijuana, but overall significant decreases. And one thing we didn't include in the slide, but if I've got one extra minute, just to follow up on some of the information that Queen provided, what I wanted to say and include is that the team has done exceptional work in trying to close the gap with health disparities. So for example, we found at the end of year 2 that people who identified as Latinx or a person of color were less likely to engage in our 6-month interview. And we really took that as a proxy measure for people engaging at that 6-month follow-up mark because that interview is administered by a care coordinator. And this really speaks to the team. And as an evaluator, I can say that this is not happen as often as we'd like. Bring that information to the team, which really dug into it, really had a discussion about it, we problem solved around it, got additional representation on the team, worked really hard to boost up the representation and care coordination, and now what we just saw at the end of year 3 is those differences have evened out. So folks who identify as white, non-Hispanic have the same follow-up rates as the folks who identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color, Latinx, et cetera. So it really speaks to the ability of this team to see the data, use the data, and use it to make program improvements to close those health disparities gaps. So I think that's it, but thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a few questions. I know we're just like running 5 minutes late, and that's because we got started 5 minutes late, so it's not you guys' fault. All right, Kina, if you can run back there and take that question.
Hi. Okay. To the first gentleman, that video was very informative. I've dealt with a very highly educated child that I couldn't get through to because I didn't understand how strong that addiction was. Is there any way that can be made public? Because people that don't know about it aren't going to go online and look for it. So whether it could be done as a public service announcement on some of the TVs or just something to get it out to everybody.
Is this working? Oh, cool. Yeah, so that's already available on the ChangingMindsLarimer.com website, but there's social media and all of that. I'd really encourage you all to engage with your local community and make sure it's applicable, but it is universally true that is how people's brains respond to addiction. We have also used that with youth, and they are able to grasp the concepts pretty easily, and so it's a great tool across the lifespan as well.
Is in the know is what I've tried to become, so we need to have it so that they don't have to really search a lot,
Yeah.
that it's just there.
Yeah. I think what we can do is work closer with our statewide partners and make sure that we're better disseminating that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I use that with my daughter, and she's like, well, yeah, Mom, like, duh, it's science, right? But not everybody knows that, and so I think that is a really great video. Thanks for having that. Other questions? Okay, these wonderful people I think most of them will be here today and tomorrow. Please engage them, talk to them about how they did that. And I was at their 7 o'clock meeting 2 weeks ago at 8 because I was like, can I come at 8? It's a little far for me, but not like that bad. But I mean, it really speaks to how these guys got this work done, right? Because they showed up. And these meetings weren't quarterly at first, if I'm remembering right. they were monthly. And so a 7 o'clock a.m. meeting monthly is a lot to add for anybody. So let's just give them a round of applause for this great work. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. Other than Dr. Brooks, I guess you all can go back to your seats. Well, we're going to keep her around.